We want to start into this 9th verse talking about, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." There will be a little bit of repetition going through the subject of the peacemakers from things we've talked about in the past, because this is a word that comes from the word for peace, which is the word from which we get the fruit of peace. And we went through that fruit in a lot of detail when we went through the fruit of the Spirit. So there'll be a little bit of repetition talking about the same kind of peace that we talked about when we went through the fruit of peace. And I might quote a couple things that we ended up putting down in that book, but most of what we'll go through is going to be fresh and new on this subject. As I always do when we're going through something that's topical, we'll start with what that word is in the original language. It's pretty straightforward. It's Eirenepoios, Eirenopоis. Literally, you could say it would be a maker of peace or a bringer of peace, or even someone who works for peace to bring it about. It's made up of two Greek words, eirene, which is the word for peace that's in the list of the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of peace, that means peace, and poieo, which means to do or to make or to cause or to produce or even to manufacture something. So somebody that's a peacemaker is somebody that's trying to bring about peace. They're trying to make peace. They're trying to create conditions of peace, to manufacture an environment where there be peace. And you go on with other ways you could use that language. As I said, we discussed the word eirene in a lot of detail when we went through the fruit of peace and the study we did on the 12 fruit of the Spirit, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. I'll just remind you of a couple things about that word, which is where this word comes from. It's used 92 times in the New Testament, and the word eirene comes from the Greek verb eiro, E-I-R-O, that means to join, in the sense of joining something together or putting something broken or removed back into place or fixing it or restoring it. So you can see what peace is. It's when something's been broken. There's something that is not in its right place. It needs to be put back in its right place. That's why so often the Bible talks about us having peace with God, because having peace with God means we're restoring our relationship back to the way it should be. Something's broken in our relationship. If we're seeking to have peace with our brother or our sister, it's because something has affected our relationship. There's been a fracture somewhere in our relationship that we're trying to repair. We're trying to heal that breach. And that's what it means in its root forms. It's not just, by the way, a feeling of well-being, like we might use the phrase, "I feel at peace right now." It is the result of a restoration of a relationship that was broken, as I said, or the product of conflict ceasing between you and somebody you've been at war with. Now, when you get into the Hebrew, which I'll come back to, but when you get into the Hebrew meaning of the words for peace, like shalom, they are even deeper. They're not just about the lack of a negative condition. They're about the presence of a positive condition. But I'll come back to that and talk about it in a minute. I'm going to give you, to start out, several quotes, one of which is fairly long. The reason I'm going to start with these quotes is because they are statements that were made by writers. Most of them are writers that are much older and are passed away now, who just did an absolutely magnificent job of giving an overview of this issue, what it is to be a peacemaker. And some of the things that I'm going to read you in these quotes, we'll go back to in detail and examine in different verses and things as I go through this. But I want to give you, as I said, several quotes to get started that are kind of an overview. Some of the things they'll talk about are critical points to understanding what it is to be a peacemaker, as well as laying the foundation for, as I said, some of the things I'll go through a little bit later. Arthur Pink, or A.W. Pink as he's sometimes referred to, gives such a well-worded overview of this beatitude that this is the longest one of any quote I think I've given. It's a couple pages long, but it's so well worded, so many good points in it that I'm going to quote it here. He says, "This 7th beatitude has more to do with conduct than with character. Though of necessity, there must first be a peaceable spirit before there will be active efforts put forth to make peace." Forgive me, but I'm going to pause once in a while in his quote, because though I will go back into this in detail myself with my own thoughts on this, there's some of these points that I want to pause on and extrapolate something out of them or expand on them a little bit. Notice what he said, that first you have to have a peaceable spirit before there will be active efforts put forth to make peace. You might be forced to make peace against your will. You don't want to make peace, but that's not the kind of peacemaking God's looking for. God is not looking for peacemakers that were forced to make peace. This is me talking, not A.W. Pink. I'll tell you when I come back to his quote. But God is not looking for forced peacemakers. He's looking for people, just like we talked about with the pure in heart, that want to make peace. That's the thing about all these qualities. All the positive side of these qualities is something that is a motivation that should be causing you to want to do something. I want to be more merciful. It's not that I'm being forced to. I'm being threatened that I better. I want to. I want to be more pure in heart. It's not that somebody's forcing me to, or they're controlling me like a robot and making me pure in heart. It's that I have a desire in my own heart to want to be more pure. And in the case here of being a peacemaker, it's not that you're a peacemaker because you were ordered to make peace, like two children fighting with each other, and they're told by their parents, you better make up with one another. You better apologize to each other, straighten up, whatever the case might be. That is not the kind of peacemaker the Lord is looking for. Now, if you have caused problems that you need to fix, that might be where you'd have to start. You might have to start with the weight of responsibility that you need to correct something. But the kind of peacemakers being talked about here is not somebody that is being compelled to make peace. They're somebody that they have a desire, a longing to make peace. I'm going to come back to his quote, but as we're going to talk about it a little bit, there's multiple different layers to this. One of them is that you want to make peace with anybody that you're in conflict with, or that might be in conflict with you, which technically can't occur if you're not responding, which I'll talk about later too. But you want to make peace with anybody that thinks of themselves as your enemy or that has an issue with you. But you'd also, if you're a peacemaker, want to see other people that are in conflict make peace. If you saw two brothers in conflict, two brothers in the Lord that are in conflict, a peacemaker would want to see that condition dealt with. And you'd also want to see people make peace with God, because that's at the very heart of our relationship with the Lord, is the necessity for us to be at peace with Him. We talked about this when we talked about the fruit of the Spirit and the fruit of peace, and how deeply related the word peace is to the word rest in the Bible. We can think of that naturally. When you're in a state of peace, you're in a state of, here's a synonym for rest you don't hear a lot, repose. You're in a state of rest. But the kind of peace that the Bible talks about as a state of rest is resting from conflict. So when it talks about Israel was in a state of rest, that means they weren't in any wars with any of their neighbors. And much more importantly, when Israel was in a state of rest with God, or when we see, like we do in Hebrews 3 and 4, this call for us to be in a state of rest in our relationship with the Lord, that means you're not fighting with Him. You're not wrestling with Him. You're not in resistance to what He wants from your life. Certainly, you wouldn't be in rebellion to what His will is. So the less resistance we have to God's will for our life, the more we'll be resting. Resting from our sin, resting from any state of rebellion or resistance we might be in. And that creates peace because there's no conflict. I'm going to expand on that more later, but coming back to Pink's quote, he goes on to say, "Let it be remembered that in this first section of the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord Jesus is defining the character of those who should be subjects and citizens in His kingdom. First, He described them according to the initial experiences of those in whom a divine work is wrought." What he means by that is in the first Beatitudes, he's describing the kind of things that would be present in their disposition if they were somebody that's really entered into a relationship with the Lord and is growing in that relationship. He says the first four, talking about Beatitudes, may be grouped together as setting forth the negative graces of their hearts. They are not self-sufficient, but consciously poor in spirit. They are not self-satisfied, but mourning because of their spiritual state. They are not self-willed, but meek. They are not self-righteous, but hungering and thirsting after righteousness. He goes on to say in the next three, the Lord names their positive graces. Having tasted of the mercy of God, they're merciful in their dealings with others. Having received a spiritual nature, they now hate impurity and love holiness. Having entered into the peace which Christ made by the blood of His cross, they now wish to live in amity, which is a word we don't use often now, talking about peace, with all. The phrase, "Blessed are the peacemakers," he says, takes note of the horrible contention and enmity which sin has brought into the world. For where there is no strife, there is no need for peacemakers. If nobody was in conflict with anyone else, nobody would need to be a peacemaker, would they? But there are many people in conflict with one another. There's a lot of people in conflict with each other in their families. There's people in conflict with each other in the church. There's people in conflict with each other in the ministry. There's people in conflict with each other out in the world. But the greatest conflict of all is the conflict we might be in with God. Greater than any other need for peacemakers, we need people who are wanting to help us to restore our relationship with the Lord. There's some scholars who do not believe that's part of what this is talking about. They think this is just talking about people that are making peace between two humans, like maybe helping other people. They're mediating an argument between two brothers, two sisters in the Lord, whatever it might be. But I think this almost definitely also includes the idea of making peace between those who are at war with God and the God they're at war with. That's the greatest type of peacemaker you could possibly have, isn't it? Because you realize if you make peace with God, it'll change your life in such a way that it should cause you to make peace with your brother, make peace with your sister. But you're not going to reverse that. You're not going to say, well, if I make peace with my neighbor that I don't like, it'll make me want to make peace with God. That isn't how it works. You have to desire to make peace with God, and then that'll start a domino effect in your life that'll cause you to want to make peace with anyone that you're in contention with. Now, granted, and I'm going to talk about this in some detail at some point in these classes. I'm sure we'll have several on this particular beatitude. There are some people you cannot make peace with. If they are at war with God and they're attacking the people of God, you can't overlook that. You can't pacify them by trying to compromise or cover it up or anything else. We'll talk about that. There are two sides of this issue. The main one I'm going to focus on is the positive side, how we need to make peace and who we need to make peace with to be peacemakers, and who we need to help others make peace with, whether it's their brother they're at war with or it's God. And I'll spend less time on it, but I'm also going to talk about the things we can't make peace about and false types of peacemaking. There's some people that are convinced they're peacemakers when really all they are is afraid of conflict. They need to deal with the condition, whatever it is, before they'll ever have true peace, but they're afraid of the conflict associated with the condition that will potentially lead to peace, so they're creating a worse situation by avoiding the conflict and claiming that I'm avoiding it because I'm a peacemaker. You're not a peacemaker. You're going to create more of a problem because you don't deal with something that is an issue.
Compromising then?
Compromising is absolutely part of it, Brother Heinewalt. That's something we'll talk about a little later. Going on with Pink's quote, he says, "To be a lover of and worker after peace is one of the distinguishing marks of those who are followers of the Prince of Peace. That miracle of grace which has made them at peace with God causes them to regard their fellows with sincere benevolence, desiring to promote their best interests both here and hereafter. It is their care, so much as in them lies, to live peaceably with all men, and therefore do they abstain from deliberate injury of others. In each relationship they occupy, domestic, social, ecclesiastical, it is their desire and endeavor to prevent and allay strife. They are lovers of concord." He's using all kinds of words we don't commonly use today, but that's one of the things that I love about reading some of these older authors. I'm sorry to say it like this, but they were just more well-read, many of them. There are some brilliant people in our present day, but unfortunately, society has become so dumbed down that some of the brilliant people in our society won't be able to communicate if they don't talk down to the level of people who should have been educated to a higher level, to be able to understand deeper concepts. And sometimes we've even had people that have claimed that you need to always talk at a very low level when you're preaching or teaching. If you do, you'll never raise people up above that level. Just think about how simple that is. What if your teachers in school always taught you at a kindergarten or first grade level? You'd never rise above kindergarten or first grade. If you're trying to keep people, forgive me, this is blunt, but if you're trying to keep people captive in some spiritual state of adolescence, that you can always be a parent to them and always control them, then maybe you do want to talk down to them and keep them in that state of educational adolescence. But if you want people to rise to a higher level and have a deeper comprehension and a broader understanding of things, you'll have to use bigger words. You'll have to talk about bigger concepts. You don't lose them in the deep weeds of some of those things. You make sure they understand what you're talking about. That's why periodically, if we're talking about a complicated concept or word, I'll stop and explain it. Isn't that better than just not using them at all? You realize what happens when you use a larger word or a complicated concept, then you stop and explain it and teach on what it means? Then everybody learns something that they didn't know before. Isn't that the goal, for us to learn more? So it has always caused me a little bit of discomfort, not personally, but from the standpoint of motivation, why someone would be motivated to do this. People thinking you need to talk down to people instead of raising them up to a higher level. We don't talk to people like they're children. Some people may be children in terms of their intellect or their understanding, but we don't want to keep them there. We want to raise them up to a higher level. So our range of our concepts and vocabulary need to increase over time. I heard somebody say once that Jesus only used very simple concepts and vocabulary. The only way a person could possibly say that is if they've never studied the original language. Some of the things Jesus said were very complicated concepts. And even if you argue that he used simple points, which he did, he used a lot of everyday examples in his parables, you couldn't possibly make the same argument about Paul. Some of the language Paul used in his letters is very complex and deep theological language. Some of the concepts he described are so confusing that, as you know, Peter said they're hard to be understood. This is Peter that said they're hard to be understood. He said they're so hard to be understood that some people wrest them, which is a short form of the word wrestle, them to their own destruction. They take some Paul said and they didn't really understand what Paul was talking about. And there's a whole lot of theologians today in this category. They want to think Paul means such and such, especially when they're reading something like the book of Romans. And so they apply their filters of their presuppositions about how salvation works and overlay them on what Paul's saying and then come up with conclusions that I think Paul would be horrified at if he heard somebody saying that's what he was teaching. All you got to do is look at some of his other statements and you'll find out if that's what he meant in Romans, he completely contradicted it in 1 Timothy or in 1 Corinthians, and you can go on into other examples.
I've always thought that when those men gave Paul the right hand of fellowship, it was because they were scratching their head and said, boy, that reminds me of how Jesus taught. He did that to us a lot.
Yes, he did. And if you think Jesus was just trying to make it as simple as possible, you obviously don't understand the purpose of the parables. I think it's interesting. On one hand, some people argue Jesus is trying to keep things secret from people, and so we need to keep things secret from people, which wasn't exactly what was going on or the motivation. On the other hand, they say he made things really simple. You better make up your mind which one it is. Is everything a mystery? It's supposed to be hidden, or was it all simple? It was both. There were some things that were mysteries that were complex. Some things were very simple. But the fact is, he didn't hide the mysteries. All you had to do is give them some thoughts. You'd figure out what he was talking about. If you don't think so, some of his most complex parables that were the most brutal in their aiming at people were very clearly understood by the people he was talking about. They understood what he was talking about. It wasn't a mystery that you don't get to know what this mystery means unless you're part of the inner circle. People use that example when Jesus pulled aside his disciples a few times and expanded on his meaning, like in the 13th chapter of Matthew. He told the parable, then he told them its meaning. That means he was giving them the secret insight. If you really think that's his purpose in all of his parables, you're missing the point entirely. Now we're going to get into a whole different subject, talking about the necessity for us to educate people and not leave them in a childlike state. But I said that because some of these people I'm quoting that are older commentators that have passed away, some of which were writing their commentaries in the 1900s or even 1800s or earlier, use some language we don't use too often anymore. But that language is powerful and poetic if you understand what it's talking about. Like when he said they are lovers of concord. Concord is being in a good relationship with somebody where there is peace. He says they're promoters of unity, healers of breaches. They delight to pour oil on troubled waters, to reconcile those who are estranged, to right wrongs, to strengthen the kindly ties of friendship. As the sons of peace, they bring into the fetid atmosphere, there's a word for you, fetid, F-E-T-I-D, something that is stinking and rotten, into the fetid atmosphere of this world a breath from the pure and placid air of heaven. How much the world is indebted to their presence, only the day to come will show. Let it be pointed out that this lovely Christ-like disposition is a vastly different thing from that easygoing indolence, which is so often naught but cowardice or selfishness. It is not a peace at any price, which the Christian loves and aims to promote. That is something I am going to come back to when we look at the negative side of this. Peacemakers are not trying to make peace at any price, like, well, we're going to have to compromise some things to have peace. We're going to have to give up some truths or way we do things. No, you cannot compromise truth and what is right to make peace. That's not what the peacemakers here are about at all. He goes on to say, no, indeed, that is a false peace, unworthy to be called peace at all. The wisdom that is from above, he's quoting James 3:17, is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, easy to be entreated, full of mercy and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. He says, note well the words first pure in James' statement. Peace is not to be sought at the expense of righteousness. In other words, the wisdom that comes from above is first pure before it's peaceable. Because if you don't have the truth, and if you don't understand what the standard of righteousness is, you could compromise that by trying to make peace. You could be trying to make peace with the world. There's a lot of churches doing that right now, where they realize that the culture is changing around them, and the culture's not changing in a positive direction. No matter if liberals like to use the word progressive for themselves, whether they want to admit it or not, there are no progressives with a liberal agenda. They are all regressives, because all the things they're trying to do are regressing back to the darkest periods of human history. They're not moving forward. They always act like progressives, liberals. We're moving forward to the greatest day of peace and tolerance and other things the world's ever seen. Oh, no. The world has accepted worse things than our nation has accepted yet at certain times. What you're doing is trying to go back to the darkest time this earth existed in. You're not moving forward at all, and in terms of forward momentum towards God, you are certainly not doing that, which is astonishing to me when you see how many people that are in our leadership positions in our country at the highest levels of politics claim to be some form of Christian. And their progressive policies are exactly the opposite of biblical Christianity, exactly the opposite of something that would lead you closer to God.
Pharisees, hypocrisy.
That's absolutely right. It is hypocrisy. And most politicians are gross examples of hypocrisy. They shouldn't call themselves Christians. You should admit you're not a Christian. Or at the very least, say, I'm a Christian that doesn't believe in the Bible. Unless you're going to let the Bible guide your decisions, you must not believe in it, or else you're cherry-picking which parts you want to believe. That'd be another subject, wouldn't it? We could spend a lot of time talking about that. But I think it's interesting that Pink focuses in on this issue in James 3:17, that wisdom that's from above is first pure. You notice that the beatitude that preceded this beatitude was the pure in heart, then the peacemakers. You almost have to wonder if there's not a reason for that order, just like James first had first pure, and then it's peaceable. Because if your highest good is peace, you might make all kinds of compromises to get that. If your neighbors are carnal, nasty, wicked, sinful individuals, and they want you to accept their lifestyle, or else they're going to be constantly in conflict with you, if your highest motivation is peace, you'll compromise your faith, you'll compromise your morals, you'll compromise your integrity to get along with the neighbors, because the highest motivation is peace. But if your highest motivation is purity, righteousness, then whatever peace you seek will have to answer to that standard of righteousness, which means you cannot seek to be at peace with unrighteousness. I told you this is why I wanted to read these overviews, because it'll open up a whole lot of thoughts that I want you thinking about as we go through this over the next few weeks. He goes on to say, hence, it's important that we lose not the thread of connection between our present beatitude and the one which precedes it, which is exactly what I said a moment ago. As the pure in heart, which immediately preceded this, modifies the mercy of verse 7 and also qualifies the peace of verse 9. It means you can't have mercy for everything. You can't have peace with everything. It says, this is such mercy and peace as God himself approves of, which means if we're peacemakers, we can only be the same kind of peacemaker God is. If God is not going to make peace with certain types of conditions or people, we can't make peace with them. If they're at war with God and God's at war with them, we can't make peace with them. Now, I don't mean we go hunt them down, and assault them, but we can't be at peace with them in the sense of supporting or promoting, God forbid, what they're doing if it's evil. We cannot do it. And you might say, I need to do it for the sake of peace. I've watched some of the influencers in our present world, including conservative influencers, slowly, just watch them. Watch where they were a decade or two ago. Slowly shifting on their cultural views. Some of the most conservative commentators slowly shifting on their cultural views. You know why? Because more and more people are shifting on those cultural views, and they're afraid they're going to lose their audience, or they're afraid they're going to be attacked for being intolerant or something else. More and more ministers of God are doing it. And maybe I shouldn't put the two words on the end of that title. Ministers, because once you start compromising on the Word of God, you start compromising on the righteousness of God, you're not a minister of God anymore. You might call yourself a minister, but you're closer to being a minister of the devil than of God if you're compromising on the Word of God and compromising on the standard of morality that Word demands of us. Pink goes on to say, the same qualification is seen again in Hebrews 12:14, where it says, follow peace with all men and holiness. I cannot tell you the number of times I've heard people quote scriptures in the Bible to make a point about something, and they very often don't catch the context of the scriptures around that, or even the overall context of what the writer was addressing, and thus miss the point. They're looking for something to prove some view they have, or to support some idea they've got, or some practice they have, and they miss the whole point because they don't get the context. What's worse yet is when you don't get the context in the very same verse. I've seen some people that quote part of one verse, where if you quoted the whole verse, the way you interpret the first part cannot be true if you just finish the verse. He says, we are to avoid all needless occasions of contention, yet not to the point of sacrificing the truth, compromising principle, or forsaking duty. Christ himself did not do so. Referring to Matthew 10:34, and then he quotes Romans 12:18, where it says, if it be possible. I'll come back to this and we'll talk about this verse in detail. A lot of this is an overview. We'll come back to some of these points in detail. But in Romans 12:18, notice the first word in the sentence. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. He goes on to say the very terms of this exhortation denote that so far from compliance therewith being a simple task, it is one which calls for constant vigilance, self-discipline, and earnest prayer. He means you need all those things to be able to live peaceably with all men. Such is the state of human nature that offenses must needs come. Nevertheless, it is part of Christian duty to see to it that we so conduct ourselves as to give no just cause of complaint against us. It is for our own peace we do so, for it is impossible to be happy in broils and enmities. Some believers are of a naturally contentious disposition, and doubly do they need to beg God to hold his restraining and calming hand upon them. When disturbance and turmoil is aroused, we should diligently examine ourselves before the Lord as to whether the cause for it lie in us, and if so, confess the sin to him and seek to reconcile those offended. If we be innocent, we must meekly submit to it as an affliction. If it be true that blessed are the peacemakers, it necessarily follows that cursed are the peace breakers. That's pretty strong, isn't it? But it's a true statement. He goes on to say, then let us be diligently on our guard against bigotry, intemperate zeal, and a quarrelsome spirit. The things of God are too sacred for wrangling. Doesn't mean we cannot discuss them, but wrangling over the sacred things of God, that's foolish. He goes on to say, highly important is it that we give earnest heed to the exhortation of endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. He's quoting Ephesians 4:3. Let it be carefully noted that the preceding verse specifies the chief aids to this. In order to the development of a peaceful disposition, we must first cultivate the grace of lowliness, which is the opposite of pride. He's quoting Proverbs 13:10. By pride cometh contention, which lets you know that one of the main motivators of conflict and contention is pride. Second, there must be the cultivation of meekness, which is the opposite of self-assertiveness, the determination to press my will at all costs. Remember, a soft answer turneth away wrath. Third, the grace of long-sufferance, which is the opposite of impatience. Finally, forbearing one another in love, for the Queen of Graces endureth all things. He's talking about love that endures all things. That's the end of his quote. That's probably the lengthiest quote I've ever read in any Bible study, but there were so many points in there, I could almost just teach message after message just off of some of his statements. I am going to give you a couple more quotes. They're not quite as lengthy, and I might break them up too if I have some comments as I go through them. Alexander McLaren said that true peacemakers are created by having passed through all the previous experiences which the preceding verses in Matthew 5 bring out. They've learned the poverty of their own spirits. They've wept tears, if not real and literal, yet those which are far more agonizing, tears of spirit and conscience, when they've thought of their own demerits and foulnesses. They have bowed in humble submission to the will of God, and even to that will as expressed by the antagonisms of man. They have yearned after the possession of a fuller and nobler righteousness than they've attained. They have learned to judge others with a gentle judgment because they know how much they themselves need it, and to extend to others a helping hand because they're aware of their own impotence and need of succor. They have been led through all these, often painful, experiences into a purity of heart which has been blessed by some measure of the vision of God. And having thus been equipped and prepared, they are fit to go out into the world and say, in the presence of all its tempests, peace, be still. Something of the miracle-working energy of the Master whom they serve will be shed upon those who serve him. He went through the order of it, too, of those Beatitudes and showed how I don't know that you could precisely make them progressive in nature, but they do have a building effect to them, don't they? To where you get to this point of being pure in heart and peacemakers. And by the way, I may talk about this a little later in a future class, but there does appear to be potentially a connection between the necessity of being a peacemaker we see in this verse and having the right spirit under persecution we're going to see in the next verses, because you're going to have to be able to keep your peace. And you're going to have to seek to make peace with people that are very clearly not interested in making peace with you. If someone's persecuting you, they don't want to make peace with you, not other than conquering you. Being able to be in a state of peace with them, not by submitting to them or compromising them, but by reaching out to them and trying to heal that breach, is a delicate operation, especially when somebody is determined to be your enemy. So there may even be a connection in these last two of peacemakers and those who are persecuted. Another quote is from William Barclay, who says that in Hebrew, peace is never only a negative state. It never means only the absence of trouble, like we think of peace versus war. In Hebrew, peace always means everything which makes for a person's highest good. It's a little deeper than how we normally think of it, isn't it? In the Middle East, when people say to one another, shalom, they do not mean they wish for the others only the absence of evil things, like, I hope you don't deal with any conflict today. In the Bible, peace means not only freedom from trouble or all trouble, it means enjoyment of all good. He goes on to say the blessing is on the peacemakers, not necessarily on the peace lovers. Now, you would think those would be the same, but they're not always the same. He says it very often happens that if people love peace in the wrong way, they succeed in making trouble and not peace. We may, for instance, allow a threatening and dangerous situation to develop, and our defense, why we didn't deal with it is what he's talking about, is that for peace's sake, we do not want to take any action. There's some things you do have to respond to because it's going to be a far worse state of conflict if you don't. We'll get into that a little later, as I keep saying. He says there are many people who think that they are loving peace when in fact they are piling up trouble for the future because they refuse to face the situation and to take the action which the situation demands. I have watched people put up with endless evils, even in the body of Christ, because they would tell you if you said, why aren't you correcting this? We want to show charity and we want to keep peace among the people of God. You're doing neither one of those two things if you're allowing evil to continue, because you are not showing charity to the body or to anybody that person is doing wrong to by allowing them to continue doing wrong. One person is receiving charity while everyone else suffers. Secondly, if you're trying to keep the peace among the people of God by allowing things to get hushed that might cause controversy or conflict, eventually it is going to explode out into the open. It'll be far worse than if you just dealt with it to begin with. You say, well, we don't want to hurt a minister or hurt a church. You'd be better to hurt them so they can heal than to let that wound fester and grow and destroy that church entirely. We have had situations like that. And instead of the situation being dealt with and corrected, we've had people go in and try to support the situation and say, we're behind you, when maybe you shouldn't be behind a church that has gotten caught up in idol worship. Maybe you shouldn't be behind a church that is caught up in pure false doctrine. We're going to support that and promote it? Of course we're not going to do any such thing. God in heaven, help us. And if we do that in the body of Christ, as it has happened so often in Christendom, that you try to cover things up, do you know how many leaders have been falling in Christendom here in the last years? It just seems like one after another person who had great influence and built big churches, one after another, is just falling into some accusation. They embezzled money, or they were abusive to the people in some kind of a lordly way of abuse, or they were abusive to the people in other ways that we won't talk about in mixed company, or they took advantage of somebody, or they had relationships they shouldn't have had. It's just one thing after another. If those sort of things are dealt with immediately when you see something rising in someone that could lead to that, we'd never have to deal with the far worse conflict when it blows up. But often that's not the case among the people of God, because we have people that really believe they are peacemakers when they're trying to keep the peace over something that requires forceful action. There's something boiling under the surface that is going to explode at some point because you are covering it with a lid all the time, trying to claim that you're covering it with a lid of charity. What you're covering with a lid of charity is explosive, and it is going to blow off the top of that kettle at some point. And we cannot do that. That's happened in the past among those who call themselves God's people. Whether they are in Babylon or whether they consider themselves the body of Christ, there have been problems like that throughout the history of the church. And we have to be better than that. We have to do better than that. Our peacemaking is not covering things up. It's not trying to keep things quiet and peaceful because you don't want people to know something bad is going on. If something bad's going on, it needs to be dealt with. That's what it takes for there to be peace among the people of God, is that anyone that might do something to break the peace is too afraid to do those things because they know there'll be judgment that will follow and correction. They might lose their place, their position, their influence, and they should lose their place, their position, and their influence if they've done evil. There should be no tolerance for evil among the leadership of God's kingdom. And then trying to say, we're trying to help a person, we're trying to get them to recover themselves. They might recover themselves and get themselves back in a right relationship with the Lord, but I have no intention of helping someone recover a position of power when they have done something immoral to lose it. They have disqualified themselves from holding a position of power. And a true peacemaker would be trying to bring peace to the body of Christ. We want the people of God to be at peace. And if it takes removing belligerent spirited individuals, and if it takes cleansing immorality out of whatever level it is found in to bring peace to Zion, it should be done. And that is the work of a peacemaker, believe it or not. There's another element I'm going to come back to. I've got so many different branches off this tree that I can think of, and I haven't even finished reading some of these quotes yet. These quotes are making me think of some of these things. He goes on to say, the peace which the Bible calls blessed does not come from the evasion of issues. It comes from facing them, dealing with them, and conquering them. Do you think you're going to have peace with God by hiding your head in the sand about your sins? That's the exact kind of peace I was just criticizing here a moment ago. You don't have peace by hiding from the problem. Peace comes when the problem has been fixed. You know when you get peace with God? When you get right with God. Until we all get right with God and with one another, from the leadership to the laity, there will continue to be division and contention among God's people, as there has been throughout all the history of the church after the time of the early church. We're trying to restore the church. We want to go back to that place where there was a church operating in unity. Oh, they had people that rose up that tried to cause contention and division, like Hymenaeus and Alexander and Philetus and Diotrephes and others you could name that rose up and caused division, taught false doctrine, tried to split churches. but all they accomplished was to be cast out of the church themselves or turned over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. And the church, triumphant, went on. If we're going to be that church, we have to have the same mechanisms inside of this engine of this church to deal with those kind of conditions. And we cannot be passive peacemakers that sit back and say, we just want to let things go so everybody will be at peace, everyone will get along. And you allow evil to go on for people to get along. That's no different than what I said earlier about your neighbor. If your neighbor's doing some terrible evil thing and they want you to get on board with it, come over to their house and attend their party where all kinds of foul things are going to happen, that isn't making peace to go over and be in their party with them. You can't make that kind of peace. So, I told you there's going to be a lot of different lines we're going to touch on in this subject, interestingly enough. Seems pretty straightforward, but it's deeper than it looks. There's a lot deeper water in this subject than you might think. Before we close the evening, maybe I'll finish getting through these quotes. I don't want the whole class to have been quotes and comments on quotes, but he said, what this beatitude demands is not the passive acceptance of things because we are afraid of the trouble of doing anything about them, but the active facing of things and the making of peace, even when the way to peace is through struggle. I'm going to tell you in the deepest sense of what peace is talking about in terms of you being at peace with God, the only way to that peace is through struggle. You're going to have to get your old man and wrestle him down to be at peace with God. And if you want to be at perpetual peace with God, in a state of perpetual peace with God, where you'll never lose your peace again with him, never lose that peaceful state of relationship with him, you're going to have to just not hold the old man down. You're going to have to kill the old man so he can never get up and cause any conflict ever again. That's the cost of perpetual peace. I'm done with the quotes, I think, or at least for the moment. In the context of Jesus' statements in the Sermon on the Mount, being a peacemaker, I think, principally refers to working to make peace between yourself and other people, as well as to seek to help people who are at war with one another to come to a state of peace with each other. So that's why I said there's multiple levels of this. If somebody is in conflict with you and you're a peacemaker, you're going to want to resolve that. You're going to want to reconcile with them. You're going to want to fix that. If you see two other people, or let's use the word individuals, because I'm going to expand this out to two meanings I mentioned earlier. If you see two individuals at war with each other, Brother Kosa and Brother Hannawald are at war with each other, which I find hard to believe would ever happen. But if you see them at war with each other, your desire would be to encourage them to reconcile, help them, aid them, assist them to be at peace with each other again. And then at the highest level of two individuals, man and God. Meaning if you know somebody is in a state of conflict with God, and all of us, I believe, in this building know what that conflict will end in, that if you end your life in a state of conflict with God, what the end results of that are going to be. Death and destruction are the end result of closing your life out outside of a relationship with God and in conflict with Him. Even if you don't consciously know you're in conflict with Him. Some people don't even believe there is a God, so they don't think they're in conflict with Him because they don't think He exists. But there is a God, and whether you believe in Him or not, if you choose not to accept His invitation for relationship, and if you choose not to obey His requirements for your life, you are in conflict with Him. Whether you believe in Him or not makes no difference whatsoever. So the greatest peacemaking we can do, I said earlier, is that peacemaking between a man who's in conflict with God and the God who he's in conflict with. Because if you die in conflict with God and never enter into relationship with Him and get the peace regarding your past sins and then start working on having peace with Him regarding your present condition, you're going to be facing eternal destruction. There is no greater call for us to be peacemakers than for us to help other people make peace with God. So I think there's all of those layers in it. I told you there's some scholars that believe this is only referring to being peacemakers in relation to other humans, like you making peace with someone at war with you or two other people in conflict. It's as if they can't understand the concept of a human operating in a mediatorial role between God and man unless it's Jesus. But that's what all ministers are doing. And by the way, it's not just people with the office of a minister. That's what all the children of God are doing if they ever witness to anybody. Do you realize if somebody is not in relationship with the Lord, it doesn't matter if you're a minister or not. If you're a child of God and you're witnessing to someone who's not a child of God, you are filling the role of a mediator at that moment, trying to mediate between them and God. Now, you can't do it in the way Jesus does, at the level Jesus does, but all of God's children are intended to be mediators with the lost. We're all intended to reach out to the people who are at war with God and try to coax them into a condition of peace with God. It may take more than coaxing with some people. To try to compel them, if that's what it takes, to come to a condition of peace with God. I think any person who truly desires peace with other people and peace for other people, whether you're talking about peace between you and somebody else or peace between other people that you see at war with each other, any individual who knows God is going to understand that no true and lasting peace can exist between anyone that's a part of the creation until they're brought into a state of peace with God. And if we're really living in a state of peace with God, it will instigate us to want to see other people in a state of peace. I'll give you another quote. I guess I'm not done with the quotes for tonight. Rod Mattoon said that God's blessing is on the peacemaker. This is a repetition of something I quoted that Barclay said. He says, God's blessing is on the peacemaker, not necessarily the one who is a lover of peace. The Lord is not speaking about people with a peaceful disposition or those who love peace. He's referring to those who actively intervene and get involved to make peace. Now, by the way, that's not a criticism of people that love peace or that have a peaceful disposition, but you might have a peaceful disposition because you just don't like conflict. It may have nothing to do with anything spiritual. The fact that you don't like conflict might mean if somebody is in conflict with you or if you see two other people in conflict, you might love peace, and that's exactly why you won't do anything about it. I don't want to deal with the conflict. Some people try to divorce conflict from peace, but sometimes it takes conflict to get to peace. Right. It's just like a war. If the war has to be fought for there to be peace, you need to just fight the war and get it over with. The war is part of the process of getting to peace. Not all peace is that way. Some things we start out with peace and we end with peace. But some things there's a process and you won't get to peace until you face and deal with the conflict that's part of the process to get there.
The chastening of the Lord brings the peaceable fruits of righteousness to those that are exercised thereby.
Absolutely right. Mattoon goes on to say that the Lord is referring to those who actively intervene and get involved to make peace. The natural tendency of most people is to watch strife from the sidelines. Some folks like to watch a good fight because it's exciting to watch. God's approach, however, is to take positive action toward creating peace, even if it means taking abuse. That means you may have to go through some conflict that you might not want to have to deal with because I'd rather just have peace. I realize none of us want to face things that shock us or unnerve us or shake us up or cause us anxiety or whatever. But some of the things that cause us anxiety, we are never going to be free of the anxiety till we face the condition and defeat it or move through it. It's like if you were in a state of anxiety over some sin you did. When do you think that anxiety is going to leave? You're going to have to resolve the condition, aren't you? You're going to have to open up your heart to God and say, I'm sorry for this sin I did. I recognize I did it. I'm sorry. If there's someone you sinned against, you're going to have to deal with that person to reconcile with them. The only way you'll ever get peace in that regard is to correct the condition, to fix the problem. Many times, peace is only the result of fixing a problem. Another quote. I guess I'll get all my quotes out of the way ahead of time for most of them. John Phillips said that sin introduced conflict into this world. The first sin separated man from God. This is me talking now. Effectively means it put him at conflict with God. Do you think when God commanded them not to do something, they did it? They were still at peace with God? The moment they disobeyed God's command, they were in a state of conflict with God. He goes on to say the second sin, Cain's murder of Abel, separated man from man. Have you ever thought about it that way? The first sin broke the relationship between God and man, but there wasn't anything other than maybe Adam and Eve's back and forth that I'm sure occurred that we see hinted at in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, and that probably continued after that. We don't see a record of anything occurring between two humans that broke their relationship in some devastating way between themselves until Cain. That is what you might call the second sin. So the first sin broke our relationship with God. The second sin is when man broke his relationship with man. And now people have followed in the footsteps of both of those. But the peace that the peacemakers who are blessed, like we read about in this beatitude, are seeking is peace between man and God that'll heal that rift that was created by the sin of disobedience of our first forebears, and that'll eventually result in a peace that stretches out across all the creation and affects every man. One of these days, every man will be in a state of peace with God, and I mean that as mankind, men and women. Every human will be in a state of peace with God, and every human will be in a state of peace with every other living creature. And by the way, I think every living creature will be in a state of peace with humankind. There'll be no animal that'll attack you anymore because it's aggressive or hungry or anything else. There'll be no human being that'll try to take advantage of you, lie on you, steal from you. All the creation will be in a state of peace. Yeah. That will be a world to see, won't it? All the things that we see about the descriptions, and it is difficult to understand what the world to come is like. And of course, people have gotten into all kinds of picturesque fantasy ideas about heaven and the new heavens, the new earth. But what we see is incredible enough. A world without sin, a world without any of the evils and wickedness and corruption that goes on, a world wherein dwelleth righteousness, a world where there's no pain, no suffering, no death, a world where everything is in a state of perfect and perpetual peace. Conflict is, in some ways, only possible if both parties engage in it. One person can instigate conflict towards another person, but if the person being attacked doesn't choose to reciprocate, it's really not conflict in the strict sense of the word, which means even if somebody is at war with you, you can still be at peace with them. Now, I'm not talking about in the natural sense where another nation decides to invade your nation and you say, we're just going to be at peace with you. Well, you won't be at peace for long. You'll be subject to them pretty quick if you just sit there and let them come in and take over. And that's precisely why we have to find a balance in this too. When it comes to things that don't affect your salvation or that have nothing to do with compromising morality or truth, if they're trying to be our enemy, we should try to love them with all our heart. We should try to seek peace with them and for them, with God, with all the strength and ability we have. But if they're trying to create conditions that will undermine our morality, or they're trying to do something that is going to damage the church or the people of God, or they're defaming the word of God, those aren't things you can seek peace with someone over. Those are things you're going to have to be in a state of conflict with them about. Technically, there can't be a true conflict if the object of the attack doesn't choose to engage in battle with their attacker. That's one reason why so many scholars believe that the peacemakers in Matthew 5:9 might be paralleled with those that are persecuted in the 10th through the 12th verse. The idea being that if you're going to be a true peacemaker, you're going to seek even to make peace with the people that are persecuting you. Do we have an example of that in the Bible that might be the epitome of all examples?
The Lord himself.
When in the Bible did the Lord demonstrate that better than any other example in the entire Bible?
Forgive them, Father.
Yeah.
On the cross. Not just being persecuted, but horribly tortured and murdered. He's seeking their peace. And do you realize the very thing he was letting them do to him was the process to give them that peace? That is how incredibly deep and rich and layered the process of the death of Christ is. That what he was going through was the process to give peace to the people that were doing it to him. What kind of God do we serve that would use that kind of process? So you'll think, well, that's horrible. That just shows you how incredible God is. That he would allow something like that. Allow that kind of suffering to demonstrate, here's why. When you go through some great sacrifice for somebody, it proves your love to them. One of the greatest ways to prove your love to somebody, if it's your friend, if it's your spouse, I don't mean go find something to do this, but I mean if you're in a situation where you have to sacrifice yourself for them or put yourself in jeopardy for them, I'm going to tell you what, if you were walking with your spouse down the road and somebody leaped out of an alley with a gun and went to shoot her and you leaped in front of her, I'd imagine that would change the dynamic of the relationship from that moment on. She would know in a deeper and more real way than ever before that you loved her. There's lots of other examples we give. We give the opposite examples of ladies doing things in the same kind of self-sacrificial way. My wife self-sacrificially spent herself for me this last year that I was going through this cancer diagnosis. She didn't miss a thing that I was going through, no matter what it cost her. It meant her job had to be a lot harder because she had to catch up on a lot of things because of the nature of going with me to my appointments. She had to watch her husband suffering. You think anyone wants to watch someone they love suffer? She had to go through one wave after another. Do you know what it did? Watching all that for me proved her love to me more than any word she could have ever said. That's what Jesus was doing on the cross. That's why he had to endure that terrible brutality. It's because he wanted to make sure there was no way you could doubt his love. You say, why would he have to endure that brutality? Because you could still doubt his love. He didn't really give much for me. He had all the power in the universe, so it wasn't a big deal for him to forgive me. To forgive you, he had to suffer and die. And that route was chosen as a way to prove his love. You realize he himself said there is no greater love than this. This is before he faced the cross. What an incredible thing to say. Do you realize he was saying this as a foreshadowing for his disciples? That when they heard this, they probably wouldn't have even understood it. They thought at that moment, I think they still were believing he's going to be this messianic kingly figure in this coming that's going to defeat Rome, restore our glory, and all these things. And yet Jesus says to them, no greater love hath any man than this, than that he laid down his life for his friends. And they might have thought, well, yeah, that's a good lesson. But I don't think they understood the impact of it until after the cross. And then they realized he was telling us, there isn't any way I could show my love to you in a more potent form than to offer myself for you. And he did that, didn't he? Talking about conflict and the necessity for peace, I'm going to jump around on some of these scriptures because I've got several different lines of thought in my mind related to this issue of peacemakers as we go through this over the next couple of weeks. But I'm going to start with this point in the 12th chapter of Romans, where it looks like he's connecting the very same two things that some of these commentators have been talking about being a peacemaker, and the 10th, 11th, and 12th verse of Matthew 5 about being persecuted and not reviling and not reciprocating and taking it in the right way. It does look like those two might be connected, and it looks like that may be something Paul's alluding to in Romans 12. Notice what he starts with in the 14th verse, and I'll go through the 21st. Bless them which persecute you. Bless and curse not. They're attacking you, but you're not attacking them. Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and weep with them that weep. Be of the same mind one toward another. Mind not high things, but condescend to men of low estate. Be not wise in your own conceits. Recompense to no man evil for evil. In other words, when someone does something evil to you, you don't respond by doing some evil in return. You realize Paul is literally expanding on what Jesus said in the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th verses of Matthew 5. Whether he was consciously thinking of that or the Spirit was inspiring him in that direction. He said, provide things honest in the sight of all men, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you, is what I quoted earlier, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place unto wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink. For in so doing, thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. Right in the middle of this passage I just read, what I quoted earlier, where it says, if it be possible, as much as lieth in you. The word if there that I mentioned when I quoted that earlier is very important because sometimes it simply may not be possible to live peaceably with all men, particularly if they're in a state of open war with God and with God's people. You can't live peaceably with people in a condition like that. But that does not entitle us to take vengeance on them, and we're still intended to show them love, even if we can't be in a relationship with them or exist in harmony with them, at least presently. Because it may be that the enmity they have for God will be changed if they are affected by our love and by our example. This same connection between this idea of being a peacemaker and seeking peace and also responding right to persecution, which, as I said, might connect these last two Beatitudes, Peter seems to make the same connection also in 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3, 8-17 says, finally, be ye all of one mind, having compassion one of another, love as brethren, be pitiful, which doesn't mean be pitiful like look pitiful, like sad and dejected. It means to show pity to others. Be courteous, not rendering evil for evil or railing for railing, but contrariwise blessing. In other words, contrary to your nature. Someone rails on you, your nature is to rail back or to get defensive. Instead, bless them. And I don't mean in the southern way that some people say bless your heart when they're really saying bless their heart. They're saying what a moron is what they really mean, or something worse by bless their heart, I mean really bless them. Knowing that you are thereunto called that you should inherit a blessing. For he that will love life and see good days, let him refrain his tongue from evil and his lips that they speak no guile. Let him eschew evil and do good. Let him seek peace and ensue it. For the eyes of the Lord are over the righteous, and his ears are open unto their prayers. But the face of the Lord is against them that do evil. And who is he that will harm you if you be followers of that which is good? But and if you suffer for righteousness' sake, notice Peter seems to be talking about the very same things Jesus was pinpointing in the last couple Beatitudes. But and if you suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye, and be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that whereas they speak evil of you as evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ. For it is better, if the will of God be so, that you suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. So I think Peter and Paul both taught some somewhat expanded lessons on the very things Jesus was talking about. Many Christians, especially those in the Babylonian church and its different myriad periods of persecuting people, have labored under the false belief that they're at war with all those who are seeking to be at war with them, and that unbelievers, especially antagonistic agnostics and atheists, are enemies that they're in personal conflict with. Like that person doesn't believe in the Lord, they're my enemy, and so I can treat them bad because they're an enemy of God. Certainly don't have to seek their peace. That is absolutely false. It's not human agents of lies and hate that are our true enemies. It's the beliefs and the origins of those beliefs that are what are our greatest enemy and the real adversaries we have to overcome. Ideologies and different ideas that are at war with God and the forms through which they're disseminated and assimilated are the antagonists that we have to defeat, not the individuals. An individual's easier to target as an enemy because they're right in front of you. You can hit them with your fist. You can hit them with your words. But they're not the real enemy. The idea that has corrupted their mind is the enemy. The emotions that have been twisted in them in some way that have created the wrong feelings are their enemy. And perhaps, as we believe, there are enemies in the invisible realm that are influencing them in some way. But they, as individuals, you might call them enemies or enemies of righteousness and other things like that, but they're not our true enemies. They're nothing more than slaves that are fighting in a war that they don't even realize that they're so brainwashed, they're so drugged up, so to speak, that they're fighting a battle they don't even understand they cannot win. There's been different times in history. I'm not going to go into detail on this. This is one of the origins of where we even get the word assassin from, is one of the beliefs from which that word came is a group of religious zealots who their leaders drugged up heavily with drugs and sent out to kill their enemies. I'm not going to get into all the history of it, but that group is one of the groups from which they think that word originates, the word for an assassin, somebody that assassinates people, murders people. The people in this world who are at war with God, many of them, there is something that has taken hold of their mind and their heart that has corrupted them. Now, they can be a tremendous enemy to you. They can cause you great harm. They can cause God's people and God's word great harm in the sense of defaming it. They can't do anything to the incorruptible sea of the word of God, but they can certainly defame it in the eyes of other individuals. But those individuals are captives themselves. They've become addicts to whatever their carnal condition is. Just like someone that's an addict to those drugs where they would drug somebody up and they needed that drug, and then under the influence of that drug, they would do all kinds of things they wouldn't normally do. It's what's so dangerous about being under the influence of anything. When you're under the influence of something, you will do things you would not normally do. If there's a possibility that you could be attracted to some lustful thing, it'll be enhanced by that. If there's something in you that is easily angered, you have a bad temper, it'll be enhanced by that. And we don't want to be under the influence of the most powerful influencing agent of all, our carnal nature, let alone if there are influencing agents in the spiritual realm. And there are certainly influencing agents in the natural realm, because there are people all around us trying to influence us to evil in all kinds of ways. Even if they don't know who you are, they're trying to influence you to evil. The things they put on the covers of magazines or on billboards or in commercials on the television. There's one wave of influence hitting you after another all around you. You could say, well, I'm going to shut down and not go out, not look at anything, not go online for any reason. You're not going to escape it by that. It's everywhere. You go to the grocery store. You could drive your car down the road. You just have to be a better guardian of your heart. See, this is the point. It's not about becoming a hermit on a mountainside so nothing ever comes before your eyes that might tempt you. It's about being a better guard of your heart so you're not tempted by those things. So even if it surrounds you, it's not going to affect you. I don't mean go out in an environment where it's around you, but we're moving into an environment in terms of this Western world where it's everywhere now. It's bombarding us from all sides. It used to be you had to go to a pretty nasty environment to see some of the things you're seeing right on the public streets now. You used to have to go someplace where someone would have to tell you where to go, and you'd have to get in and everything else to some foul, filthy place to see things now. You can just walk down a public street and see.
It's on the street.
This world is filled with filth and degradation. But most of the people in this world are prisoners of that, don't even realize they're prisoners of it. They think they're just free and doing whatever they want, but they don't realize the things they're doing are the works of a slave, not of a free man. My point in saying all that is when we're talking about being peacemakers, we do need to realize we do have enemies and we do have conditions we have to take a stand against, but we have to be careful not to personalize them when it comes to other human beings and say, so-and-so is my enemy and I've got to destroy him. Look, it doesn't matter if somebody is teaching a doctrine of devils. It's not the man that you're trying to destroy, it's the doctrine. We want to deliver the one teaching the doctrine of devils. We want to destroy the doctrine. And we've got to be able to make a distinction between those two things, and that's why I'm pointing out a couple of these things and why it is so important to talk about being peacemakers, be the right kind of peacemakers. There are certainly a lot of people in this world that are adversaries of truth. And many of them are adversaries of the very truth that'll make them free, as John 8:32 talks about. But the truth is still powerful enough, if it can reach them, to make them free. So it's not the deceived, no matter how diabolical and malicious they might be, that are our true enemies. It's whatever has deceived them. They may be the actors that are carrying it out, and they certainly bear guilt. Doesn't get them off the hook. They're certainly guilty for their actions, no matter what influenced them or what kind of conditions were involved. But I'm talking about who we see as our enemy. We don't want to see the individuals as our enemy. We want to see them as prisoners. No matter how they present themselves, they're prisoners. No matter how they want to claim that they are free agents and they're doing what they want, they are nothing but slaves to their own desires. You might think, well, that's great. What's wrong with that? That's not slavery at all. If I get whatever I desire, that's the best freedom of all, is it? What if you have a problem with eating too much and you're a slave to that desire? Will it make you miserable? Will it destroy your health? Say, I have the freedom that I can eat everything I want. I can sit all day long and eat everything in the fridge. Yes, you do have that freedom, but that's not freedom, that's slavery. You're enslaved to your appetite, and your appetite will destroy you. You'll get heavier and heavier until you're absolutely miserable in the body you're living in, and eventually create all kinds of health conditions for yourself, and very likely dramatically shorten your life. I'm using just one natural example of appetite. People say, well, I have the freedom to eat whatever I want. It's like somebody that their parents made them eat certain foods, wouldn't let them eat a lot of sweet snacks, was always giving them healthy snacks. Now they moved out, I can eat whatever I want. My whole cupboard's going to be filled with Ho-Hos and Twinkies, and we must have some Ho-Ho and Twinkie lovers in here. You all start laughing. Some fried pies. Oh, I can eat some fried pies from Amish country. I'm going to tell you right now. Some lemon or some blueberry and cream or something. Some cheesecake in my fridge. The whole thing is packed full of sweets and everything else. Yep, you have the freedom to do that. And you might think that's freedom, but it's not freedom. It is you proving you're a slave to your appetite. And if you allow yourself to stay in the chains of that slavery, your appetite will kill you. That's what people are doing with sin. They're thinking, I'm free to do anything I want. I don't have to obey God. Sort of. You do have to obey God, but you may choose not to. But you're not free. You're a slave. You're a slave to all those appetites, which are appetites that will destroy you. There was a rock band back when I was growing up whose name of their album was Appetite for Destruction. Well, that is what your carnal nature has. It's an appetite for destruction. You think, I have the freedom to feed my appetite, whatever appetite I have. That's where the world's at right now. In terms of any perversion or evil that you could imagine. How dare you tell someone they can't do that? Because I don't want to see them kill themselves. That'd be like saying, how dare you tell somebody they can't drink a bottle of Drano? Because I don't want to see them die. Of course I'm going to tell them not to do that. If you saw somebody with nobody would be carrying one. If you saw somebody with a jug of cyanide and they're like, blessed be, they wouldn't say blessed be the name of the Lord, by the way, but they say, blessed be the name of the devil, which is probably what they'd have to be thinking if they're doing this. I can do whatever I want. I'm drinking this bottle because I think it'll probably taste good and nobody can tell me what not to do. You'll get the results of that pretty quick. You'll be dead real quick. That's not freedom. That's slavery to your appetites. If you had an appetite drawing you so powerfully towards drinking cyanide, that appetite is literally, as this man said, an appetite for destruction. That is an appetite that will destroy you. That's not freedom. That's slavery. Yep. There's no peace when you're constantly hungry. How peaceful would it be if your stomach's gnawing at you all the time? There's always a gnawing inside of you that I'm never satisfied. Remember what we read about the definition of peace from a Hebrew perspective, that it's not just a cessation of conflict or a lack of war or problems. It's the other side. It's that you have all the good benefits. All the good things are happening in your life. There's nothing peaceful about suffering with a hunger for something that is never satisfied. That's not peace. That's why I think, by the way, if you want to take this in somewhat of an order, hungering and thirsting after righteousness comes even before being pure in heart, because you've got to hunger and thirst after righteousness if you're ever going to be pure in heart. But if you finally come to the place where you're truly pure in heart, and not just a peacemaker, which is critical, but you're a person who is totally living in a state of peace with God, you won't have to hunger anymore. Your hunger will be satiated. But one hunger you'll never have if you come to that place is a hunger for the wrong things. See, our hunger for the wrong things is destructive hunger. It's not edifying. The more you eat those things, the quicker you'll die. To come back to this word peace, there's no peace in a constant state of anxiety. There's no peace in a constant state of hunger that is never satisfied. Like someone that's an addict, and as soon as they get their fix, there's this momentary state of euphoria. That's exactly the word I want. There's this momentary state of euphoria where you feel like you're at peace. And then when it's gone, there's no peace again. And you're about to lose your mind needing to have that fed. But what you're looking for to feed it, to give you that state of euphoria, that peace, is the very thing that is killing you. Where God is saying, I'll give you a peace that passes understanding. It's better than any euphoria any drug can ever create. Once you fully receive that, once you're living in that state of perpetual peace, you'll never go back to a withdrawal symptom. God's trying to fill us, not starve us. Sin will starve you because no matter how much of it you get, you always have to have more, and you still never feel satisfied. I told you we can go off on all kinds of branches of this tree of peace, and every one of them is an important branch that we could spend some quality time on. Those who might oppose us, individuals who might try to wage war against us, whether they know it or not, are slave soldiers. They're conscious or unconscious captives of their carnal natures. And as we see the devil, at least, they're under the influence of a singular enemy, at least in a corporate sense of his influence, because they've chosen to emulate him, and they've become enemies of righteousness and of anyone who seeks righteousness, as you can see, so many of them in our present world, because they're the children of the devil, following in his footsteps and allowing him to influence their thinking and their actions. But despite the fact that they're determined to be our enemies, we are still called to present them with an offer of peace. And we're called to be agents of that peace in every engagement we have with them. That's difficult. And you've got somebody that's determined to destroy you. I'm going to stress this again before we close out this session. And I'm going to really spend some time on this in one of our future classes on this. I'm not talking about some passive, let the enemy roll over you, let the enemy take advantage of you type of peacemaking. I'm talking about an aggressive peacemaking. A recognition that the person that I am trying to help make peace with God is going to be destroyed if this isn't corrected. If they're my enemy because I'm on the Lord's side, then they're God's enemy. Right. If they're against me because I believe in a standard of righteousness, and that standard of righteousness comes from the righteous and holy and true God, they're God's enemy. And if they're God's enemy, one day they're going to be destroyed, which means the greatest gift you can give them, do this for their sake. Do it out of love, even if they have not shown you any love. Even if all they've shown you is hate. A true peacemaker will stand right in the face of hate and persecution and seek to make peace on behalf of that person. Let's come back to what we said about Jesus a few minutes ago as we close out. There is no better example of a perfect peacemaker. That's why Isaiah 9:6 refers to him as the Prince of Peace. He's the perfect peacemaker. He made peace with the people that hated him most. His cross was a symbol of peace. The very instrument used to torture and take his life was a symbol of peace. And now if they'll accept it by figuratively coming to his cross, when we talk about someone coming to the cross, we're just talking about them coming to the Lord and recognizing what occurred on the cross. When you come to the cross, it's an internal exercise that you are in your mind coming before the Lord and saying, I recognize what you did on the cross. What you did on the cross was the price of my peace. I've never had peace in all of my life. I've had little glimpses of euphoric flashes maybe from time to time where I felt so good because I got something I wanted, or because I felt some emotion that was a fleeting emotion, or because of some, God forbid, drug or something else that gave you some short span of euphoria. But I've never had true peace. And now when you come to the cross, you're right at the foot of the foundation of where all your peace rests. And you're standing there for the Prince of Peace saying, you suffered this for my peace. He's the greatest peacemaker of all, isn't he? And so if we want to follow in Jesus' footsteps, we have to be peacemakers. And the greatest example of that I've been spending quite a bit of time tonight talking about, we'll talk about some other aspects of it next time, is that we need to be willing to even be peacemakers with those who hate us, those who are our enemies. To tie together those passages, like I believe consciously or unconsciously, Paul and Peter both were in Romans 12 and in 1 Peter 3, as well as in tying together what Jesus was getting at in Matthew 5:9 about the peacemakers and Matthew 5:10-12 about enduring persecution with the right spirit. We've got to be able to even stand in the face of terrible persecution and be working under that strain of suffering to try to help the person persecuting us to come to a place of peace with the God of heaven and earth. My Lord in heaven, isn't the process of God an incredible thing? When you look at it, it's rough. It's hard. There's a reason it's so hard. It's because God does the hard things. And he did. He was willing to do that for us, and his son was willing to do it.
And we lived.
And because of that, we live.
Hallelujah.
Praise his holy name. Because the greatest peacemaker in all the history of the universe came down to this earth to make peace for us.
Yeah.
And now we have to be peacemakers like he was.
Yeah.